Hey everyone, we're about to take a journey into this incredible revolution that's happening right now in our understanding of mental health. It's a huge shift from just describing symptoms to actually understanding what's going on under the hood.
If you've ever felt that way, you are not alone. For decades, the whole process has been about conversations, about checklists, and it can all feel kind of subjective, right? A little confusing, even. So we're going to unpack exactly why that's been the case and where this new science is taking us.
And this slide right here, this really gets to the heart of the whole transformation. For so long, we've been navigating mental health with, let's call it an old map. It's a map that describes the terrain. It tells you what a disorder looks like based on its symptoms. But now, we're building a new blueprint. This blueprint shows us the underlying structure, the actual brain circuits that explain why those symptoms are happening to begin with.
So, for decades, psychiatry used two main guidebooks to navigate this terrain: the DSM, which is primarily used in the United States, and the ICD, which is pretty much used by the rest of the world.
Now, it's really crucial to get this. These manuals aren't like biology textbooks that describe a new species of frog discovered in the Amazon. They are human-made systems. They're built by committees of experts to give everyone a common language, which is incredibly useful. But because they're human constructs, they can sometimes draw the line between what's considered normal and what's not in slightly different places.
Let's take ADHD as a perfect example. The American DSM considers failing to give close attention to details or making careless mistakes as just one single symptom. But the international ICD, it actually splits that into two separate symptoms. Now that might sound like a tiny, nitpicky difference, right? But that small change can literally determine whether or not someone meets the official criteria for a diagnosis.
And this is exactly why the entire field is shifting. The goal is to find the biological why behind all the symptoms. And that whole search, it starts right down at our most fundamental level, our genes.
So first things first, forget the idea of a single gene for depression. It just doesn't exist. What science has found is that the genetic risk for something like major depression is what we call highly polygenic. That just means it's influenced by thousands of different genes, and each one contributes just a tiny, tiny fraction of the total risk.
So what scientists can do is add up all those tiny little bits of genetic risk to create something called a polygenic risk score. And as of right now, that score can explain about 5.8% of the liability for developing major depression. Now I know 5.8% might not sound like a lot, but in the world of genetics, that is a monumental leap forward in being able to predict who might be more vulnerable just based on their DNA.
But of course, genes are only half the story. The environment is constantly talking to our genes, and it does that through something called epigenetics. The best way to think about this is like little dimmer switches on your genes. Life experiences, things like stress, trauma, even what you eat, can come along and turn those switches up or down. It changes how your genes are expressed without ever changing the DNA code itself. This is literally how nurture becomes nature.
Okay, so we've got the genetic foundation, and we have the environment tweaking it. But what does that actually look like inside the brain? What's going wrong at the biological level?
A lot of us grew up with the chemical imbalance theory of depression, that it's all about having low serotonin. Well, it turns out that story is way, way too simple.
Here's the modern view. It looks like chronic stress can cause the connections between neurons in key parts of the brain to kind of wither away. What antidepressants seem to do is promote neuroplasticity. They actually help the brain repair itself and grow new connections. It's a structural fix, not just a chemical top-up, which also explains why they take weeks to really kick in. They're not just flipping a switch, they're helping a construction project.
And this repair job happens across these huge brain-wide networks. One of the key ideas here is the triple network model. Just think of your brain as having three big systems. First, you've got the default mode network. That's your brain on idle, your inward-looking, daydreaming, self-reflecting brain. Then, there's the central executive network. That's your get-stuff-done brain, focused on the outside world. And then crucially, you have the salience network, which acts like a switchboard, toggling you between those two other modes.
Now in depression, this whole system gets thrown out of whack. That default mode network becomes hyperactive. It gets sticky. The switchboard has a hard time shifting you out of it. And this is the biological root of rumination. That feeling of being completely trapped in a negative feedback loop inside your own head.
Okay, now get this, because this is absolutely fascinating. Your brain can interpret a social threat, like feeling isolated or rejected, with the same alarm bells as a physical threat, like an injury. So it tells your immune system to activate, creating inflammation.
And what does that inflammation do? It creates something called sickness behavior. You feel tired, you withdraw from people, you can't feel pleasure. Does that sound familiar? It's basically the core symptom list for depression.
So, if the problem is faulty brain circuits, well, the solution is to fix those circuits. And it turns out that pretty much all of our treatments, from talk therapy to high-tech devices, are really just different ways of doing that exact same job.
And you can see two totally different paths to repair right here. Something like cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, is a top-down fix. You're basically strength training your prefrontal cortex, the CEO of your brain, to get better control over your emotional centers. But then you have something like psychedelics, which offer a bottom-up reset. They temporarily dissolve that super rigid default mode network. It's like shaking up a snow globe, which allows the brain to escape old stuck patterns and form new, healthier connections.
And for cases that are really resistant to other treatments, we have this whole toolkit of technologies that can directly intervene in the brain's circuits. The one you've probably heard of is ECT, or electroconvulsive therapy. It's a powerful, whole-brain reset that triggers a massive release of a growth factor that promotes the birth of new brain cells. A more targeted version is magnetic seizure therapy, or MST, which uses magnets for a more focused effect, aiming for the same benefits with fewer side effects. Then there's TMS, or transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is totally non-invasive. It uses magnetic pulses to gently nudge specific brain regions and modulate their activity. And finally, there's deep brain stimulation, or DBS, which is kind of like a pacemaker for the brain, using a tiny implanted electrode to make continuous, subtle adjustments to a very specific circuit.
So, where is all of this science heading? This is the really exciting part. It's leading us toward a future of what's called precision psychiatry. The whole idea is to stop treating a generic label like depression and start treating an individual person's unique biology.
And this isn't some far-off sci-fi idea. It's already starting to happen. Remember that inflammation connection we talked about? Well, research shows that about a third of patients with depression have high levels of inflammation. But here's the kicker. We now know that this specific group is way less likely to get better on standard antidepressants. So a simple blood test could identify these patients right away and guide doctors to try a completely different strategy, maybe an anti-inflammatory one, from day one. This quote just captures the whole mission perfectly. The goal is to get rid of the very idea of an average patient, because there's no such thing. The future is about understanding each person's unique biological story and tailoring the treatment to fit that story.
Which leaves us with one last, kind of mind-blowing thought to chew on. As we keep moving from the art of conversation to the science of biology, will we one day diagnose something like depression not just with a checklist, but with a blood test, or a brain scan, or a genetic score? The new science of mental health suggests that day might be a whole lot closer than we think.